For 38 years, Harriet Bloom had been the most feared judge in the Tarrant County Courthouse. Except her name wasn't Harriet, and she had never once been afraid of anything. Her name was Cecelia Voss, and the fear belonged to everyone else. She had put away killers, dismantled cartels, overturned corrupt plea deals that had stood unchallenged for a decade. She had been appointed to the federal bench at 41, became the youngest chief judge in the Northern District of Texas at 46. And somewhere in between all of that, she had forgotten how to be a person. Not in the dramatic way people talked about in movies. Just quietly, the way a room gets cold when nobody notices the window was left open. She stopped calling her sister back. She stopped eating lunch with her clerks. She stopped remembering the names of the cleaning staff who mopped her floors every night, even though some of them had been doing it for years. People called her the Iron Bench. Not to her face, never to her face, but she heard it. She let them keep saying it because it was useful. A judge without sentiment was a judge nobody could reach, and nobody reaching her meant nobody could buy her, threaten her, or break her. What she never told anyone was that the accident had already done all three. 7 years earlier, a drunk driver had run a red light on I-30 just outside Fort Worth, and the collision had taken her husband, Gregory, her left knee, and something else she couldn't name. Something in the center of her chest that used to hum when she looked at him across a crowded room. Gregory was gone in 30 minutes. The knee healed eventually, though it ached in the cold, which in Texas wasn't very often but enough to remind her. The thing in the center of her chest never came back. She moved through the years the way a courthouse moves. Heavy, procedural, built to last but not built to feel. Then, on a Tuesday in November, the night janitor dropped a photograph. Cecelia worked late most nights. It wasn't ambition anymore. Ambition implies you still want something. She worked late because her house in Westover Hills had 14 rooms and she had stopped being able to fill them with sound. Her law clerks always left by 7. By 8, the entire 5th floor of the Eldon B. Mahon Courthouse was empty except for her, the hum of the building's ventilation system, and whoever was on the overnight cleaning rotation. She rarely looked up when they came through. That Tuesday she was reviewing a sentencing brief, 3 weeks into a case that had already taken 9 months out of her life, when she heard the cart in the hallway. The particular squeak of the left wheel that she had unconsciously memorized without ever meaning to. The door to her chambers opened. She didn't look up. "Evening, Judge." She said nothing. She had learned that responding to pleasantries cost her 20 minutes she didn't have. The man, she knew it was a man from the voice, low and steady, moved around the edge of the room with the cart, emptying the small trash bin near the bookshelf, wiping down the windowsill. He worked quietly, which she appreciated. Most people filled silence with noise out of nervousness. He didn't seem nervous at all. She was almost finished with the brief when she heard something hit the floor. Not the cart, not a cleaning supply. Something lighter. She looked up. A small photograph had fallen from the man's shirt pocket and landed near the leg of her guest chair. He was already crouching to pick it up, but she saw it first. A little boy, maybe 6 years old, sitting in a hospital bed, wearing a paper crown that someone had drawn stars on with a gold marker. He was grinning the way children grin when they don't yet understand that the world requires them to stop. The man beside him in the photo was laughing, his head thrown back, his whole body given over to it. The man in her chambers did not look like that right now. He straightened up, tucked the photo away carefully, and Cecelia heard herself speak before she decided to. "Your son?" He turned, and she saw him properly for the first time. Mid-30s. Tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. The kind of tired that lived in the jaw and the eyes. He had a name tag on his shirt that she had never once read in the months he'd been cleaning her office. Wesley. Wesley Pruitt. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "That's Owen." Something about the way he said the name. Not sad, exactly. Something more careful than sad. How old? He just turned 7. Wesley folded the cloth in his hands, the way people fold things when they're trying to decide how much to say. "He's been at Cook Children's since August." Cecelia set down her pen. Cook Children's Medical Center. She knew the name the way any Fort Worth resident knew it. The big hospital off Lancaster, the one with the murals on the outside walls that parents drove past and tried not to think about too hard. "What's wrong with him?" she asked. The man looked at her evenly, without the flinching apology she usually got when she asked direct questions. "Aplastic anemia. His bone marrow stopped producing normally. They're managing it, but he needs a transplant eventually. And the wait list." He paused. "The wait list is what it is." She nodded once. Then, because she didn't know what else to do with what she was feeling, she picked up her pen again. Wesley Pruitt finished wiping down the windowsill and left quietly, the cart squeaking once in the hallway before fading. Cecelia sat with the brief for another hour but read nothing. She told herself it was professional habit that made her ask her assistant the next morning. Background checks, due diligence. She dealt in facts, she liked facts, facts were manageable. Her assistant came back with a 2-paragraph summary by noon, but Cecelia had already asked for more. What came back wasn't 2 paragraphs. Wesley Allen Pruitt, 34, had moved to Fort Worth from Lubbock 3 years ago. His wife, his dentist, died from a post-surgical infection that the hospital's own report called preventable. Owen had been 4. Wesley had taken whatever work came, warehouse loading, was overnight security, and for the past 18 months, custodial staff at the courthouse 8 p.m. to 4 a.m., 5 nights a week. He also picked up Saturday shifts at a grocery distribution center in Haltom City. When Owen was stable enough for Wesley to leave him with the neighbor woman on the 3rd floor of their apartment building. He had filed for supplemental insurance twice, and been denied both times on technically. That made Cecilia's jaw tighten when she read them. Owen's primary nurse at Cook Children's had been quoted in a small local article about pediatric aplastic anemia awareness. She called Owen one of the most resilient kids she'd ever worked with. She said his father came every morning before his shift at a second job Wesley apparently worked on weekdays, delivering auto parts, and every night before the courthouse rotation. He had not missed a single day at Owen's bedside in 4 months. Cecelia read that last part 3 times. She was 61 years old. She had sentenced men to life without parole. She had presided over cases that made national news. She had spent 7 years building a wall around herself so carefully, so deliberately, that she had genuinely believed it was load-bearing, that without it, she would fall. She sat in her chambers for a long time that afternoon, without reading anything at all. She didn't go to the hospital right away. That wasn't who she was. Instead, she noticed. She noticed that Wesley always arrived exactly at 8, never a minute past, and always left every surface cleaner than it needed to be. She noticed that he never asked for anything, never complained, never made the particular noise people made when they wanted you to know they were suffering. She noticed that on Wednesday nights he brought a small plastic container of food and ate it in the hallway on his break, standing up in 10 minutes flat because sitting down apparently took longer. One night, she left a cup of coffee on the edge of her desk before he came in. She was in the attached conference room, reviewing materials, and heard him pause when he entered, heard the small silence that meant he'd seen it. He came to the doorway. "Judge Voss. You didn't have to. It was going to go cold anyway," she said without looking up. She heard him pick it up, heard him say thank you quietly to no one in particular, or maybe to her, or maybe just to the night. She did it the next Wednesday too, and the one after that. They started talking somewhere around the 3rd week, not about anything important at first. The weather turning cold, a particularly strange case that had been in the local news, whether the vending machine on the 4th floor that stole dollar bills had ever been reported to anyone in facilities management. He was funny in a dry, understated way that she hadn't expected. He asked her questions that weren't deferential, weren't performing, weren't trying to get something from her. He asked what the hardest case she'd ever presided over was, and when she told him, a custody dispute involving 3 children and 2 sets of grandparents and no good answers, he didn't offer platitudes. He just said, "That sounds like carrying something that didn't have anywhere to land." She looked at him for a long moment after that. "That's exactly what it was," she said. She went to Cook Children's on a Saturday in early December. She told herself it was because she'd had a free afternoon, which was untrue. She told herself she was in the neighborhood, which was also untrue. She drove herself, parked in the visitor structure, and sat in the car for 6 minutes before going in because she was. And she would never have said this out loud. Nervous. Owen was in a room on the 4th floor with a window that faced a parking structure, which was unfortunate, but someone, Wesley, presumably, had taped a series of drawings to the window frame, so that when the light came through in the afternoon it made the paper glow a little. Paper stars, paper birds. A paper rocket ship that had been colored with about 12 different shades of orange. Owen was awake when she arrived. He was small for 7. Smaller than the hospital bed made him look somehow. With his father's same watchful, unhurried eyes. When Cecelia appeared in the doorway, he looked at her with the frank curiosity children have before they learn to pretend they're not looking. "You're Dad's judge," he said. Wesley, who had been untangling a pair of headphones in the chair beside the bed, looked up with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something caught between surprise and a softness he usually kept back. "Owen, it's all right," Cecelia said. She stepped inside. "He told you about me. He said you leave coffee," Owen said. "He said it's good coffee." Cecelia looked at Wesley. Wesley looked at the headphones. "It's courthouse coffee," she said. "It's terrible coffee." Owen smiled. It was a big unguarded smile, the same one from the photograph, the paper crown smile, and something in Cecilia's chest that she thought had calcified years ago shifted very slightly, like a door settling on its hinges. She stayed 2 hours. Owen showed her a book about deep-sea fish that he'd been working through, pointing out the ones he found most interesting and explaining, in significant detail, why the anglerfish was both terrifying and underrated. Cecelia, who had not genuinely listened to anyone speak about something purely for the pleasure of it in longer than she could remember, listened to every word. When she left, Wesley walked her to the elevator. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I know," she said. "But you did." "Yes." He looked at her the way people rarely looked at her. Not with deference, not with calculation, not with the particular wariness people reserved for judges and bosses and anyone with institutional power. He looked at her like she was a person who had done a kind thing, and that was all, and that was enough. The elevator came. She got in. She rode down 4 floors and sat in her car for a while before starting the engine. She was not crying. Cecelia Voss did not cry, but her hands were still on the wheel a long time before she put the car in drive. She started visiting most Saturdays. She didn't announce it as a pattern or give it a name. She just appeared, the way people appear when they've stopped pretending they have a reason not to. Owen began saving things to show her. Articles he'd found on the hospital's iPad. Drawings he'd made during the weeks when his hands were steady enough. A clay sculpture of an anglerfish he'd made in the hospital's art therapy program that she put, at his insistence, in her coat pocket and carried home. It sat on her kitchen windowsill. The 14 rooms of her house felt slightly different with it there. She couldn't have said exactly why. She also started pushing back against the insurance denials. Not officially. Not in any way that could be questioned. But she knew people, and the people she knew how to read a policy exclusion and recognize when one had been applied incorrectly. The second denial was reversed within 3 weeks on technical grounds that had apparently been overlooked. She said nothing to Wesley about it. He mentioned it once, in passing. Something changed with the insurance. They approved the secondary. With the careful neutrality of a man who suspected something but wasn't going to press it. She said, "Good," and handed him his coffee. He said, "Thank you, Judge." She said, "It's still terrible coffee." The transplant donor was found in February. Wesley called her. He had her number by then, given carefully, used rarely. On a Thursday night when she was still in chambers, and his voice on the phone was different from any way she'd heard it before. Stretched thin in a way that was not quite happiness and not quite fear but both at once, the particular tone of a person standing at the edge of something enormous. "They found a match," he said. "When?" she asked. "Surgery's in 3 weeks." She let out a breath slowly. "Good," she said. "That's very good, Wesley." A pause, then. "Owen wants to know if you'll be there, after, when he wakes up." Yes, she had a sentencing hearing in 3 weeks. She had a federal trial beginning in 4. She had not taken a personal day in 2.5 years. "Tell him yes," she said. Owen's surgery took 6 hours. Cecelia sat in the waiting area on the surgical floor with Wesley. Which meant she sat with Wesley's neighbor from the apartment building. A woman in her 70s named Bet, who had clearly decided that Cecelia was his now faintly, and proceeded accordingly, offering her coffee from a thermos and asking questions about her childhood, her work, and whether she'd ever learned to cook or just always eaten at her desk. Cecelia answered all of them. She ate a granola bar from the vending machine at hour 3. She watched Wesley stand at the window and sit back down and stand again and sit. She had presided over proceedings that lasted weeks, sat still through testimony that would make most people leave the room, maintained composure in every circumstance that called for it. Sitting next to this man while his son was in surgery was the hardest thing she had done in 7 years. She didn't look away. At hour 5 she said, "Gregory, my husband, used to say that waiting was a skill, that people who couldn't wait were just people who couldn't let anything be out of their hands for a while." Wesley looked at her. "He was a patient man," she said. "More patient than me, which is saying something, since I spent my career waiting for people to stop lying." She paused. "I miss him. I don't say that very often." Wesley was quiet for a moment. Then, "You don't have to say it often. You just have to know it's true." She nodded once. Then they sat together in the particular silence of people who have stopped needing to fill it. The surgeon came out at hour 6 and said that Owen had done well, that the transplant had gone as planned, that they would know more in the coming weeks, but the early signs were what they hoped to see. Wesley made a sound she had never heard from him. Something between a breath and a word, quiet, private. The sound of a man setting down weight he had been carrying for so long. He no longer noticed how it had bent him. She reached over and put her hand on his arm, just briefly, without comment. Bet, from the other chair, said, "All right then," and poured more coffee. Owen woke up later that afternoon. Cecelia was there. She was standing near the window when he opened his eyes, and he looked around the room the way children do when they come back from somewhere far. Slowly, then all at once. He found his father first, then Bet, then her. He looked at her for a moment with those watchful, unhurried eyes. "Did you bring the coffee?" he asked. It was so unexpected that she laughed, genuinely laughed, the way she hadn't in so long, that it surprised her own face. "No," she said, "but I can." "Okay," he said, and closed his eyes again, apparently satisfied. Wesley looked at her from across the room. She looked back. There was no dramatic speech, no moment where someone said something that summed everything up neatly. That was not how this worked, and they both knew it. But something had been exchanged in the last 4 months that didn't require naming. Something that had moved, slowly and irreversibly, in the direction of being alive. Owen was discharged 11 weeks later. After the transplant began to take hold the way the doctors had hoped. He walked out of Cook Children's Medical Center in April wearing a paper crown that Bet had made him, decorated this time with real glitter, which got on everything and stayed there for days. He complained about it, while also being clearly delighted. Wesley kept one hand loosely on his son's shoulder the entire walk to the parking structure, not gripping, not hovering, just there. Cecelia had offered to drive. She did not think of herself now as someone who visited people in hospitals and drove children home, in her car. But there she was in the parking structure, with a 7-year-old in the back seat, who was already asking whether anglerfish could survive in freshwater, and what the deepest lake in Texas was. And Wesley in the passenger seat with the window cracked, the afternoon light coming sideways into the car. She didn't know the answer to either question. She said so. "We can look it up," Owen said. "We can," she agreed. 6 months after that, Cecelia established a foundation in Gregory's name, the Voss Legal Aid and Family Assistance Fund, specifically to support families navigating medical and insurance denials involving children. She had help drafting the charter from 3 of the best administrative lawyers in the state. She funded it from her own accounts, from money that had been sitting quietly for 7 years doing nothing. She did not put Wesley in charge of it, because he had Owen to look after and a life to rebuild, and did not need her handing him institutional responsibility. What she did was ask him, one Wednesday night over courthouse coffee that had finally been upgraded to a halfway decent blend at her specific request, whether he thought Owen might like to be involved someday. Whether a kid who knew as much about bone marrow donation as Owen did might want to talk to other kids who were scared about the same thing. Wesley thought about it for a moment. He would love that, he said. He'd want to make them drawings. "We can provide materials," she said. "He'd want to be in charge of the paper crowns." "He's in charge of the paper crowns," she said. Wesley smiled. It was the same smile from the photograph, the one she had seen from across her office floor on a Tuesday in November, when everything in her chambers was still and procedural and closed. And she thought, not for the first time, that she should have read his name tag sooner. The law, she had said to her clerks 100 times, is a living document. It changes because people change, and people change because things happen to them that they didn't plan for. And then they have to decide what to do with what they've been given. She had spent 7 years deciding nothing. What she knew now was this: the people who find you when you are most absent are not always the ones you expect. They don't announce themselves. They come in through a side door at 8 o'clock at night, with a squeaky cart and a photograph in their pocket, and a child somewhere across the city who is fighting hard. And sometimes, if you are very quiet and very still, and you remember for just a moment to look up from the work, they change everything.